First of all, forgive my bad English, please, and welcome to all. It gives me great pleasure to host David Benatar and welcoming together with my lifelong friends, Luca, Lo Sapio, Rossella, BONITO, OLIVA, MAURIZIO, MORI, and I hope to see Pier Giorgio Donatella and all my lifelong friends. I have many doubts about the overall structure of David Benatar's theories, but I consider myself a modest scholar of philosophy, so I am sure I will be proved wrong. For this reason, I have a great pleasure in giving the floor to David Benatar and then to Luca Lo Sapio, who has so well translated this book. So I am very happy to give the floor to David Benatar. David, welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to Professor AMODIO for the introduction, and thank you to the various hosts, especially Dr. SAPIO for arranging the whole event, and also for the translation of this book that we'll be discussing today. By the way, Professor AMODIO, your English is excellent. I wish my Italian were a fraction as good as your English. So I thought that what I would do today is just provide a very brief overview of the book, The Human Predicament. It's not clear to me how many people have read it, but even those who have read it might want to have a sort of distillation, a summary of what I've said. And I will look at the main ideas of the book. So one central topic of the book is the idea of meaning in life. And unlike some philosophers who try to give a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for what is meant by meaning, I take this question to be much easier to answer. I think that when people are asking about the meaning of life, what they're asking is something like, what is its significance, or its importance, or its purpose? Now, obviously, these three sorts of ideas, significance, importance, and purpose, are not exactly the same thing. There's some overlap between them. But I think that this is roughly what people are asking about when they want to know whether their lives have meaning. So my view is that the meaning in life is possible, but I think it's only possible at what we call the terrestrial level, or what I call the terrestrial level. So there can be meaning that a life has to one's immediate family. At a broader terrestrial level, there can be a meaning to a community. There can be the meaning of a life to all humankind. There are some lives that have that sort of level of meaning. If you think about somebody, for example, who finds a cure for COVID-19, that person's life would have meaning or significance or purpose from the perspective of all humanity. And so I do think that from these varying terrestrial perspectives, meaning in life is possible. A broader perspective from which I think our lives are meaningless, and that is the cosmic perspective. So if we move out from the Earth and we look at the Earth, as it were, from outer space, from the point of view of the galaxy, the cosmos, from that point of view, it doesn't look like any of our lives have meaning. That seems to be the case, but in a moment, I'll just say a bit about how people try to respond to that. So I think that this perceived meaninglessness of life from a cosmic perspective is something that many people, not everybody, but many people find to be abhorrent, they find to be troublesome. And thus there are a variety of responses, optimistic responses to this. The first of them is what I call the theistic gambit, or the theistic approach, which is to suggest that there is a God, and that God who provides the sort of cosmic view is the one who endows our lives, our individual lives, with meaning. So there's a disagreement among philosophers about whether God, as understood in the monotheistic tradition, could really provide our lives with the right kind of meaning. There's some people who are skeptical of that. I'm not skeptical that if there were a God, he could provide us with the right kind of meaning. What I'm skeptical about is that there is a God. And this is not a subject that I exhaust in the book. Obviously, there's a vast philosophical literature on this, but the rough idea is that if we look at the world, this does not look like the handiwork of an omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent being. If you look at the amount of suffering in the world, including in the natural world, it looks incompatible with that theistic picture. Now, the attempt to respond optimistically to the perceived absence of meaning from the cosmic perspective isn't just the preserve of theists. There are atheists as well who seek to minimize the unfortunate truth here, I believe. One kind of response that secular people or atheist people have is to discount the cosmic perspective, to suggest that the fact that our lives have no meaning from the cosmic perspective doesn't matter. One such person is Thomas Nagel, who says that if what matters now won't matter in a million years, then what matters in a million years doesn't matter now. That's one kind of secular argument that's advanced. Now, I can't do justice to this or other arguments in the short time available, but very briefly to respond to an argument like that, what I would say is that what matters later can affect what matters now. There are scenarios where what comes later affects what matters now. So if you think about somebody getting a disease, for example, and let's imagine that whether it matters whether they have this disease, perhaps a silent disease. If they will be killed by something else first, then it doesn't matter that they got the disease now. Whereas if nothing else would kill them and this disease would manifest eventually, well, then it does matter that they got the disease now. So it is sometimes the case that what matters later affects what matters now. Another secular attempt is to just focus on terrestrial meaning, to look at all the ways in which life does have meaning, and simply to ignore discussion of the absence of the cosmic meaning. And my response to that would be to say that I acknowledge that there is the terrestrial meaning, and that is part of the truth, but there's another part, and that is the absence of the cosmic meaning. So the human predicament is not merely about the absence of meaning from a cosmic perspective. Another feature of the human predicament is the quality of human lives. And one of the claims that I make both in this book and also in the earlier one on antinatalism is that the quality of our lives is much worse than most people think. There are two steps to that argument. The first is to point to empirical literature, which shows a number of features of human psychology which should lead us to distrust subjective assessments of the quality of life. I think in the interest of time, I won't say too much about that empirical literature. It is something we can discuss later. But in brief, the psychological phenomena are what are called optimism bias. Then there's the principle of accommodation or adaptation. So we adapt to our condition and begin to ignore the bad things. And then finally, there's the phenomenon of comparison, where in assessing the quality of our lives, we compare ourselves to a reference group, to other human beings. And that leads us to overlook many of the bad things in life. So that's the first step, is recognizing the unreliability of our subjective judgments. The next step is to show just how much unpleasantness there is in life. And I give lots of examples of this. The feeling of feeling too hot or too cold, a very small part of our life is felt at exactly the right thermal level. We spend part of the day hungry and thirsty. Then our bladders and bowels become full. So these are sort of daily unpleasantness. And then there are many awful fates that await people. I'm thinking about people being badly burned or suffering paralysis or suffering from infectious diseases or suffering from cancer. So there are a lot of bad things that happen to people at some point in the course of their life. Let me mention a few indicators of why we should think that there is more bad than good in life. If you think about pains, they tend to last longer than pleasures. So there are such things as chronic pains. There are no such things as chronic pleasure. The worst pains are also worse than the best pleasures are good. And then if you think about people's desires, only a subset of all their desires will be satisfied. And when desires are satisfied, people often turn out not to be as happy as they thought they would be. And even when they are as happy as they thought they would be, new desires follow in the wake of the satisfied desires. Now, again, there are lots of what I call secular optimistic theodicies. So these are secular attempts at trying to put a more optimistic spin on the quality of life. And one of these is to say that the bad things in life are necessary in order to have the good things. And my response to that is to say, well, isn't it bad that it's necessary? Wouldn't it be better if we could appreciate the good things without the bad things? Some of us are actually able to do that, but wouldn't it be better if more people were able to do that? Moreover, wouldn't it be? We don't need quite as much bad as we have in order to appreciate the good things. When people might think that death would be a welcome release, but in fact, I argue in the book that death is not good generally. I mean, there are circumstances in which it is, but generally, death is not good for the person who dies. And what that means is our predicament is a real predicament because we are caught once we are born between the suffering of life and the bad of death. This doesn't mean that immortality would be good under every circumstance. You can certainly imagine scenarios in which immortality would be very bad, but subject to a set of conditions which I mentioned, the option of immortality would be good, if it were possible, which it's not, of course. Because of what I've said about death, it also implies that in general, suicide is not an answer to the human predicament. Again, there can be exceptions when the quality of the life becomes really unbearable, but it's not a generalizable solution to the human predicament. And finally, I'll just say a couple of words about how I think we should respond to the human predicament. The first and obvious one is the antinatalist view, because if life is a predicament, the best way to avoid it is by not bringing new beings into that predicament. More generally, what I recommend is a pragmatic pessimism. And what a pragmatic pessimism does is it allows for distractions from reality, but not denials of it.
Thank you, David. Really thanks for the clarity and of exposure and synthesis. I think there is a lot to discuss.
The next person to speak is Dr. Luca Lo Sapio.
Thank you, Professor David Benatar. I'm going to make my intervention in Italian, then Silvia will translate.
So the first point was what you call the paradox of existence of non-existent beings. And the idea there was that we can either create meaning through creating babies, or we can have the antinatalist project, but you can't have both of those. If you don't produce children, that's going to be a way of sacrificing meaning. And I'm not convinced this is a paradox. I think it's a harsh reality. There are obviously multiple ways of creating meaning. One way of doing that is through children, but it's not the only way. And the question we have to ask ourselves is whether we are justified in bringing that benefit to ourselves, given the pain and the suffering that that inflicts on others. In other circumstances, we don't think that we're entitled to inflict pain and suffering on people in order to secure those sorts of goods for ourselves. If my torturing people were to bring meaning to my life, we don't think that I would be justified in torturing people. And I would say something similar about procreation. So I don't think that, that this is a paradox so much as an unfortunate reality. Dr. Lo Sapio's second point was that the antinatalist view is unlikely to be adopted by everybody. It's only likely to be adopted by a minority of people. And therefore, wouldn't it be better if we instead focused on enhancement of humans in order to minimize suffering? So I'd like to say a few things about this. Firstly, although I'm often represented as being a utilitarian, the arguments that I've advanced in the book Better Never to Have Been are not in fact utilitarian arguments. I think these are theory neutral arguments. Utilitarians of a certain kind might be interested in minimizing suffering, but I think my arguments apply also to others, such as Kantians, who would think that you have a duty not to bring about this sort of evil, and you're not permitted to do that even though you might derive certain benefits from it. So that's the one point, is that you mustn't conflate my view with a utilitarian view. I think my view is neutral between utilitarianism and other theories. And the other point I would make is that the projects of antinatalism and enhancement are not, again, mutually exclusive. So it may be that the best thing to do is not to have children at all. And it may be that if you're not going to follow that path, that the second best is to make sure that the quality of your children's life is as good as it possibly could be. But that would be a distinct second best for me.
Pier Giorgio Donatelli, who is one of the most refined voices of the bioethics question, is professor at University of Rome La Sapienza. Thank you, Pier Giorgio.
It feels very strange to be translated into English, but I also feel very privileged that Silvia is doing such a wonderful job. So I will just do the Italian, and then Silvia will follow. So thank you. And thank you also to David Benatar. It's really a pleasure to meet you in this strange way, which is now actually common.
So first of all, Professor Donatelli suggested that I make two kinds of claim, an empirical ones and philosophical ones. And he said that the empirical ones could be false. And I agree, yes, once you're making an empirical claim, it could be false. But then we need to have a discussion about whether there's reason to believe that the empirical claims that I make are false. And I think there's not. It may be that there are other people who think I'm mistaken about that, but precisely because it's an empirical claim, we need to engage the empirical literature. I've presented that. I've presented reasons why I think we should distrust the optimistic view of these matters. But I agree on the conceptual terrain that we're looking at an empirical question that has to be answered empirically. Another point that Professor Donatelli makes in a few places is that the terrestrial meaning gets lost once you adopt the cosmic perspective. And I think that's true in some sense and not in another. I mean, if what you mean is when you adopt terrestrial perspective, when you adopt the cosmic perspective, what matters at the terrestrial perspective no longer matters at the cosmic one, then yes, I agree that's true. But I don't preclude the possibility that you retain the other perspective. So I don't think that when people, let's say, relieve suffering on Earth, the fact that that doesn't matter from the cosmic perspective doesn't mean to say that there's no terrestrial meaning in that activity. So I have a pessimistic view, but it's not so pessimistic that I lose sight of the terrestrial value. From the terrestrial perspective, doing certain things matters a great deal, and that provides enough reason for us to do them, even though that meaning gets lost from the cosmic perspective. Professor Donatelli also suggests that there can be value in things that don't have purpose, and that can be true here on Earth, and so it may also be true of humanity having value, even though we have no purpose in the cosmic realm. And what I would say here is that, first of all, you have to understand what you mean by purpose. So there can be different views of purpose. Sometimes the value that we derive, let's say, from the beauty of a briefly flowering flower, you might say, well, that has no purpose beyond what we enjoy. But our enjoyment of it can be a purpose. And so what I very much doubt, and this is maybe a point of disagreement between us, what I very much doubt is that if there's no subjectivity in the entire universe, if there are no conscious beings in the entire universe, I deny that there would be anything of value. Okay. I think that value is derivative from there being some subjectivity. Another point that Professor Donatelli makes is that if there were enhancement of the human species, my view is that it would never be enough. And he deduces from that that my claim no longer sounds like an empirical one, but rather a metaphysical one. And what I would say in response to that is that I can imagine a scenario in which there were such enhancement that we reached the levels of perfection. And then I would say that would be enough. So I can imagine the scenario that I don't think that then existence would be preferable to never existing, but I do think we could then be indifferent between existence and never existing. What I would deny is that this point that I argue ceases to be empirical and becomes metaphysical. I do agree that it's not entirely empirical, I think, but it's the other half of it is axiological. Or perhaps normative. So there's a value, there's an evaluation that I'm making. The one point is how good can you make life? How many of the unpleasantnesses can you remove? And then there's an evaluative claim about how good does it have to be in order to be good enough? So I think there's partly an empirical question, partly an evaluative question, but I don't think it morphs into or becomes a metaphysical question as a result.
Okay, so here, Professor Giannini is Thank you. I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to proceed by flashpoint, but I hope that because I'm going to be so brief and concise, what I will say will not sound too polemical, David, but it will open up the discussion. But the brevity, I hope that because of the brevity, this will not sound too polemic. That's not, of course, the intention.
There's a lot there, and not all of it was clear to me. So I'm going to try to distill what I take to be the essence of the critique and give a few responses because the time's also limited. The premise of this argument seems to be that my central concern is the search for meaning, and I would actually deny that. My concern starts off by just looking at the world around me. That includes me, and it includes the world around me, and seeing what I see. And I see a lot of suffering. I see a lot of unpleasantness. Now, sometimes when people confront that, they ask, well, is there some point to this? If you, let's say, go to the dentist and you put yourself through the discomfort of a dental procedure, you might be willing to do that because it's got a point to it. It's going to prevent worse things happening later. And so the search for meaning is not entirely, but heavily generated by the quality of human life. I agree that people's assessments can differ from time to time. What I think is pretty stable is the things like the optimism bias.
Okay.
So here's an example. If you go back, let's say 500 years, there's no anesthetic. If you've got to have a tooth removed or you've got to have a leg amputated, you're going to have that without anesthetic. You might have a little bit of alcohol or something to dull the pain, but you're going to have that. And yet for thousands and thousands of years, you have humans believe that it is acceptable to bring into existence a being that will face that prospect. Now, if we look back in time, we might say that's horrific. It's horrific to put people through that sort of thing. But what we lose sight of is that there are other horrors today that people are subjecting their children to in creating them. So I do think that when you make the evaluation can alter on the details, but I think the optimism bias is a fairly standard feature of the human psychology. Yeah. Let me try to address a sort of perspectival point that seems to be a recurring feature in Professor Giannini's comments. So, for example, he says that, if I'm understanding him correctly, that the idea, the antinatalist project, has no meaning from the cosmic perspective. And so he seems to be suggesting, if I'm understanding him correctly, that there's a kind of paradox here, because if I really care about the cosmic perspective and antinatalism doesn't matter from the cosmic perspective, how can antinatalism really matter? That's what I would deny. And I think this would tie in with a point that Professor Donatelli made at the moment. So the fact that I can envisage a cosmic perspective doesn't make it my perspective. Let's just think about a more prosaic example. So we have this phenomenon of being able to read other minds. Some beings are able to read minds. When I say read minds, I don't mean science fiction. I mean, I can view from your body language what you're thinking. The autistic people lack that capacity, but other people can mind read. They can tell what somebody else is thinking and they can tell how they're feeling. Now, when you do that, it's not that the other person's perspective is your perspective. It's that you're trying to adopt their perspective. Now, you may be doing it imperfectly, but it's still an attempt to adopt their perspective as opposed to their perspective just being your perspective. And I would say something similar is true with respect to the cosmic perspective. When I try to imagine the cosmic perspective, that's not my perspective. That's me attempting, perfectly or otherwise, perfectly or imperfectly, to imagine the world from some other perspective, namely the cosmic one. Characterization, in other words.
Maurizio Mori.
I think I can make my question very short and direct to David, and then I translate by myself.
Thank you very much. So thank you to Professor Mori for a very succinct critique. I realize that he's left out lots of argument. And so let me just try to address that general concern, which I am familiar with. He correctly characterizes my view that coming into existence is a harm, and that going out of existence is also a harm. What I should say and clarify again is that I don't think that going out of existence is always a harm, all things considered. So I agree with him that if life becomes bad enough, that although it's a harm to die, it's a lesser harm than continuing to exist. There are fates that are worse than death. But the point I'd want to make, the central point, is that let's imagine that when your life starts, it doesn't start out as bad as it's going to get, but it gets worse later. Then it may be that you should not have come into existence because of what comes later and what you'll have to go through, and the fact that you'll then have to die. But that doesn't mean to say that in the early part of your life, suicide is the appropriate response. It may be that once you're here, and once you have that interest in continuing to exist, that the suffering you currently feel isn't enough to defeat that interest in continuing to exist. But that you could get to the point in life where it gets so bad that then it is no longer in your interests. And that's one of the reasons I think that explains why you can sometimes get the asymmetry. I'm not saying there's always an asymmetry, but why you can sometimes get the asymmetry.
Last but not least, Rossella Bonito-Oliva.
Rossella Bonito-Oliva was thanking everybody for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. So let me say a few things. First of all, it's hard to know for sure what generates this desire for transcendence. I would suspect that it is a product of our increased cognitive capacity. So other animals are able to make assessments of their well-being. They often do that through pain and pleasure, and they move towards positive experiences in a way that is aversive or negative ones. And then I think as we become more encephalized, once we have greater cognitive capacity, then we begin to think about our condition in more abstract ways and broader ways, and that enables that project of transcendence. And then there was a question about whether the look towards the cosmic view was a religious view. And my answer to that is, for some people it is, and for other people it's not. I do think that for many people, God fills in this gap. It provides the meaning that people want. Other people can't commit to that kind of theistic view, and they nonetheless feel, perhaps they feel more acutely, the void. Third point was about the cosmic view being an anthropocentric view as well, and that I would want to reject for the same reasons as I did earlier. It is humans trying to imagine the cosmic view, but that doesn't make it an anthropocentric. It's not anthropocentric, it may be anthropogenetic. In other words, there may be humans adopting the cosmic perspective, but that doesn't make it anthropocentric. But I do think that there is an attempt there to escape from, or to give an accounting of the suffering that's going on. If there were that broader perspective, it might make the suffering of life easier to bear. Final remark was about the importance of parenthood and meaning, and importance of procreation, not just for the parents, but for other people. And I fully accept that point. I don't think that it increases the justification of procreation, but I certainly recognize that the meaning it generates is not only for parents.
Yeah, thank you, David. David, would you like to say something before you?
Thank you. Yes, I just want to thank everybody for their very careful attention to the book and for their very thoughtful comments. And so I'm very grateful for that facilitation and for everybody who's participated in the symposium. So thank you very much.